Boston, 2009. Winter had arrived early that year, bringing with it a biting cold that made people walk hurriedly through the streets of Charlestown. Amid the comings and goings of students leaving school, 14-year-old Emily Rose Carter walked with her backpack on her back and headphones hanging around her neck. It was an ordinary grey afternoon, with nothing to indicate the onset of a tragedy. She waved to a friend on the corner, crossed the main street, and from that moment, simply disappeared. No cameras recorded her passage, no neighbors remembered seeing her, and the only trace left was her light blue coat, found 2 blocks from home, thrown over a snow-covered fence. In the first few days, the entire neighborhood mobilized. Volunteers gathered with flashlights, sniffer dogs were brought in, and flyers bearing Emily's face plastered lampposts and grocery store doors. But as the weeks passed, the search lost momentum. The sympathetic faces turned to pitying looks and conversations. In cafes were reduced to speculation. Some said she had run away with a secret boyfriend. Others said her mother was treating her too harshly. The police, lacking evidence of a kidnapping, preferred the simplest explanation: voluntary escape. It was this version that fell like a sentence on the Carter family, a cold sentence, more hurtful than any truth. As the newspapers let the case fade from the headlines, the family home fell silent. Emily's room remained untouched, the scent of baby perfume. Clung to the pillows, the books open on the desk as if she would return at any moment. But time, cruel and insistent, eroded everyone's hope, except one. Sarah Carter, her mother, couldn't accept that her daughter had simply disappeared of her own free will. There was something wrong, something no one seemed to want to see, and while the rest of the town went on with its life, she began to notice small details that didn't make sense, subtle signs that, at first, seemed coincidental. But that, over time, would reveal a pattern no one had noticed. Stories like Emily's move us in a unique way. It's not just curiosity, it's that mix of anguish, empathy, and the need to understand what really happened. Because those who love stories like this aren't just looking for crimes, but for truths that have remained hidden, for voices that time has tried to silence. And that's precisely what our community thrives on: the mystery, the twists and turns, and the chance to tell each disappearance the way it deserves, without cuts, without cold versions, with the human weight these stories carry. So come be a part of this, come to a place where every detail matters, where each case is a journey. Like now, and subscribe to the channel, because there's still much to be revealed. Sarah Carter was the kind of woman who carried the world on her shoulders and still found the strength to smile. She worked double shifts as a nurse at a Boston public hospital, coming home exhausted, but never failing to. Cook Emily dinner. The two had lived alone since her father abandoned them when Emily was still a baby. Despite the hardships, there was love in every corner of that little house. Emily's laughter filled the hallways, and Sarah said that sound was what kept her going after all this time. She didn't have luxuries, but she had a purpose: to give her daughter a better life than she had. And perhaps that's why the pain of her disappearance was so unbearable, because Sarah didn't just lose a daughter. She lost the meaning of everything she had built. In the days following the disappearance, Sarah entered a state of almost protective denial. She kept telling herself that Emily was just at a friend's house, that she'd be back in a few hours. The clock ticked slowly, and every minute without news weighed like lead. The first 48 hours were torture. She called police stations, hospitals, neighbors, and no one knew anything. When the girl's coat was found, folded strangely over a wooden fence, something inside her snapped. It didn't make sense. Emily was careful, terrified of losing things, leaving the coat behind, in the cold. No, that wasn't carelessness. It was a sign, a silent cry, that only a mother could understand. The police, however, treated it all as a common case, a teenage runaway. How many similar stories had they seen? A 14-year-old girl, separated parents, typical conflicts, raging hormones, a perfect opportunity for a lazy explanation. But Sarah knew her daughter, Emily, was cheerful but responsible. She dreamed of being a veterinarian, loved animals, and would never leave her mother's side without warning. Even in the face of the officer's coldness, Sarah insisted, "My daughter didn't run away. Someone took her." But with every attempt to talk, she received the same weary, disbelieving look. Weeks turned into months, and the house began to fill with absence. Emily's room remained untouched, with the photos taped to the wall, the books stacked on the desk, and the lamp still plugged in. Sarah couldn't turn it off. She told herself that as long as that light was on, Emily would have a way back. Sometimes she would sit on her daughter's bed and talk to herself, imagining Emily could hear. It was her way of keeping from going mad, and though the world outside continued on, inside that house, time had stopped the very moment Emily disappeared. Sarah carried a consuming guilt. She mentally replayed everything she could have done differently that day. The tighter hug, the "I love you" she forgot to say in her rush to work, the phone call she thought about making but put off. A mother's brain in these situations becomes a battlefield, a loop of unanswered questions. She prayed every night, and in the quietest mornings, she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway. She even got out of bed several times thinking Emily had returned, but the hallway was always empty. Friends tried to help her, but over time they began to drift away. Some thought she needed to move on, others simply didn't know what to say. Sarah began walking alone along the streets Emily used to walk, checking out the storefronts, the security cameras, the alleys, as if searching for a ghost. Some nights she'd stand at the bus stop for hours, watching the teenagers coming home from school, trying to imagine what had happened in her daughter's last minutes. The fear of never knowing the truth was worse than any suspicion. Between visits to the police station, Sarah began to notice something disturbing. Some of the information in her research seemed incomplete. Call logs, search reports, and even the exact time the forensic team arrived at the disappearance site were missing. Tired of waiting for answers, Sarah decided to gather every newspaper clipping, every clue, and every statement on her own. She created a mural on the living room wall with photos, maps, and handwritten notes. What began as an attempt to understand what happened became an obsession. She revisited everything. The sidewalk where the coat had been found, the cameras at the grocery store on the corner, even the neighbor's dog, which had barked insistently that afternoon. One by one, Sarah wrote down the details. The more she investigated, the more she realized that no one seemed truly interested in finding Emily. The feeling of helplessness became fuel. It was as if she were alone against the world, and in a way, she was. But what few knew was that Sarah wasn't just any woman. She carried a past that explained her stubbornness. When she was a teenager, her younger sister Claire disappeared under similar circumstances. The case was never solved. No body, no clues, only silence. It destroyed her family and left an open wound that never healed. Sarah promised herself that if she ever had a daughter, she would never let the same fate happen again. And now the nightmare was back, with the same cruelty, the same ignored signs, the same disregard from the authorities. Over the eye. Next few months, Sarah became completely isolated. Work began to falter, bills piled up, and her health began to show signs of deterioration. Physical exhaustion mixed with psychological despair. Sometimes she would spend sleepless nights rereading old notes, reviewing phone recordings, trying to find something she'd missed. And it was during one of these early mornings that something strange happened. While re-watching the video of an interview with the detective in charge of the case, Sarah noticed a nearly invisible detail. A man in a dark cap standing behind the camera crew, observing her house from a distance. He appeared in other videos as well, always in the background, always in the same spot. That made her uneasy. She froze the image and stared at the screen for minutes, trying to figure out who that man was. His face was partially covered, but what caught her attention was his fixed, unmoving gaze, as if he were watching something or someone. Sarah tried to point this out. To the police, but they laughed, saying it must have been a curious onlooker or a neighbor. She didn't believe her, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair, a spark of intuition. That man wasn't just any detail. From that moment on, the line between reason and paranoia began to blur. Sarah became suspicious of everything and everyone. She double-locked her doors, covered her windows, and avoided going out at night. But deep inside her, something screamed that she was on the right track, that there was a connection between this mysterious man and Emily's disappearance. And no matter how hard she tried to push away her fear, the feeling of being watched only grew. Until one rainy night, something happened. Something that would completely change the course of everything she thought she knew about the case. That night seemed like every other since Emily's disappearance, silent, cold, and filled with thoughts Sarah tried to ignore. The kitchen clock read 2. "47 in the morning when the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the house like a blade. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, but the insistent ringing made her jump. On the other end of the line, no one spoke. Only slow, drawn-out, almost rhythmic breathing. Sarah lay still, her heart racing with each passing second. Then she heard, very faintly, the metallic sound of a clock, ticking away the seconds like a ticking inside a cave. It was the same sound that echoed in the early mornings when she swore she heard footsteps in the hallway. She tried to speak, but the line dropped. For the next few days, that sound wouldn't leave her head. The clock, the metal, the silence between each tick. It was too real to be a prank call. But the police thought just that. "These criminals love to play with families," they said. "Hang up the phone, don't pay attention." But Sarah knew. There was something in that breathing, something that seemed familiar, as if whoever was on. The other end knew exactly what they were doing. She decided to record the next calls, and they came. 3 nights in a row, always at the same time, always the same sound. And then, on the 4th night, a husky voice whispered something before hanging up. "She's not alone." Sarah's body froze. It sounded more like a threat than a clue, but it was the first sign in months. She spent the rest of the night listening to the recording over and over, trying to decipher the background noise. There was a continuous muffled noise, something like the sound of chains or tools. She took the audio to the police, but the detective in charge didn't even take off his headphones. He said noise wasn't evidence, that without a traceable number, there was nothing they could do. She left the police station feeling a mixture of anger and fear. The world seemed to be conspiring to make the case go away. That week, Sarah began writing down everything she remembered about the day of her disappearance. Every face she saw, every conversation, every sound. She reread the official reports and realized important details were missing, like the exact time between Emily's last sighting and the police's arrival. Someone had rushed the notes. That's when a thought began to creep in. What if that metallic sound had come from somewhere specific, something nearby, something the police had never noticed? She got in her car and drove around the neighborhood, rolling down the windows, trying to recognize their sound. Sometimes she thought it was coming from a garage. Other times it seemed to be coming from underground. People began to comment that Sarah was becoming paranoid. Her own mother tried to convince her to distance herself from the case. But anyone who's ever had such a strong instinct knows the body senses when something is wrong. Sarah began to suspect details that previously seemed trivial. The electrician who lived on the corner, the owner of the abandoned house who always avoided conversation, the mailman who had changed his route a few days after the disappearance. Everything seemed to carry a shadow. It was during one of these solitary investigations that she found something that made her stop. In the back of a pawn shop where she was looking for old radios and tape recorders, the owner mentioned that someone had left a strange wall clock making a louder noise than usual. Sarah asked to listen. When the man turned the hand, the sound filled the room. The same. Ticking as the phone. The same metallic sound that had been keeping her awake for weeks. The watch was engraved on the back. HR 2009. The owner explained that it had been left by a man wearing a cap and avoiding showing his face. Sarah's stomach dropped. HR. The same initials she'd seen scrawled in the corner of a police report in the first searcher field. She left the store trembling, the watch in her hands, the sound echoing inside her head. That detail could be a coincidence, or the first concrete clue that someone close to the case knew much more than they were letting on. That night, the clock hung on the wall in the living room, ticking away in a rhythm that seemed to mock her. Sarah watched the hand spin, the repetitive sound beating like a heartbeat out of rhythm. She couldn't sleep. And it was there, staring at that seemingly harmless object, that a memory began to form. An old memory, of a visit from a strange man shortly after her disappearance, someone who offered help, but whom she never saw again. Someone who now perhaps was closer than she imagined. In the days that followed, Sarah delved even deeper into the memories that surfaced. Every detail seemed to take on new weight, every face a new suspicion. She spent hours reviewing old records, forgotten notes and recordings of phone calls. The metallic sound of the clock had become a kind of obsession. She could hear it even when the room was silent, as if the noise had settled inside her. It was a nagging, constant sensation, as if time were trying to warn her of something no one else could hear. It was then that Sarah, rummaging through one of the file boxes she kept in her closet, found an old copy of the police report. Among the papers was a name that had never caught her eye: Richard Hale, a former volunteer firefighter, who, according to the document, had helped in the initial search. At the time, she vaguely remembered a tall, calm-spoken man who introduced himself as part of the rescue team. He had a steady gaze, almost too serene for someone involved in a missing persons operation. Sarah recalled that he showed up on the first day, helped carry boxes of supplies, offered coffee to the volunteers, and after a few weeks, disappeared. At the time, the name seemed like just another one among many, but now, so many years later, there was something uncomfortable about her memory. She decided to look for him. The internet revealed little. Richard had retired in 2008, a year before Emily disappeared. He lived alone, had no children, and, according to public records, had lived in the same house for decades, just 6 blocks from the Carters. Sarah froze. How had she never noticed this? How had the police never connected the two? The details seemed small, but the coincidence was too great to ignore. Over the next few days, she began driving by the street where he lived. It was an old house with its windows always closed and a neglected yard. Neighbors said Richard was a good man, just a little reserved. He liked to fix things, spent his days in the basement, and rarely received visitors. One of them commented, somewhat offhandedly, that when the old fireman was still alive, they could always hear the sound of tools, hammering, and something banging inside the walls. Sarah pretended to find it amusing, but her heart raced. That description matched the noise she had heard on the phone calls. In the following days, she began cross-referencing information. The record showed that in the week Emily disappeared, Richard had purchased a large quantity of lumber, cement, and drywall. Common items for home improvement, but strangely consistent with the sound of hammering and his reclusive demeanor. It was as if a puzzle were beginning to come together, and pieces that previously didn't make sense began to fit together. Sarah took all these discoveries to the police. The new investigator on the case, a young man named Lieutenant Briggs, listened. Patiently, but his expression betrayed disbelief. "These purchases are over 10 years old," he said, "and this man is dead. There's nothing we can do based on coincidences." Sarah left the police station with the same feeling she always had. Emily's case continued to be treated like a wound no one wanted to reopen, but she didn't give up. Deep down, she knew she was onto something. That name, that sound, that address, everything seemed to revolve around the same invisible thread. She began. Researching Richard's house, she discovered that after his death the property had been sold and was empty, awaiting renovation. Interior photos showed old rooms, and curiously, one of them seemed smaller than the original plans had shown. There was something off about the structure. One wall seemed thicker than it should have been. Sarah wrote down the address and decided she needed to see it up close. The following Saturday, she parked her car in front of the house and stood there, watching. The curtains were still closed, the garden covered in dry leaves, the gate rusted. Nothing moved. It was as if time had stopped. She stood there for long minutes, trying to summon the courage to go inside, until a sound made her hold her breath. the muffled ticking of a clock coming from inside the house. Sarah approached slowly, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. She pressed her ear to the door and heard it clearly, the same metallic rhythm that had been haunting her dreams. And it was in that instant, standing in front of that seemingly abandoned house, that she realized it wasn't a coincidence. There was a pattern, a hint of something hidden that no one had ever noticed. And perhaps, behind that seemingly ordinary wall, there was something that would explain what really happened to Emily that cold afternoon in 2009. Sarah spent all Sunday trying to understand what she'd felt outside that house. The image of the door, the sound coming from inside, the clock. Everything haunted her throughout the night. She slept little and woke determined. She needed to go back there with someone who could help her. She went to the police station with a printed report showing the dates of the construction material purchases, the house's floor plan, and the exact location of the blocked windows. She thought they wouldn't be able to ignore her this time, but what she encountered was the same wall of disbelief as always. Lieutenant Briggs greeted her with a weary smile. Anne said that without a warrant, a formal complaint or concrete proof, no one could enter the house. "These coincidences happen, Mrs. Carter," he said, in an almost paternal tone. "Don't turn this into a new obsession." The word obsession landed like a blow. Sarah left the room without answering, clutching the papers so tightly they crumpled. Outside, the rain began to fall, and for the first time, she felt something stronger than fear: anger. The police didn't see Emily as a missing girl. They saw her as an old, uncomfortable case, a file best left to gather dust. But Sarah had no choice. She wasn't a detective, a forensic scientist, or a law enforcement officer. She was just a mother trying to prove her daughter still existed somewhere. She decided she would return home alone. That night she waited for the neighborhood to quiet down. She got in her car and drove to Charlestown, her heart racing at every turn. When she arrived, she parked a block away and watched. No lights were. No movement. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed over the gate. It felt like breaking into a tomb. The windows were boarded up, and the air smelled of old wood and mildew. She crossed the yard and leaned against the side wall. The sound was still there, faint but unmistakable. The ticking. Sarah didn't know if it was courage or desperation that kept her going, but she pushed open the back door. It was unlocked. The inside of the house seemed frozen in time, furniture covered. With sheets, old photographs on the wall, and a heavy, almost physical silence. The flashlight trembled in her hand as she walked slowly down the hallway, smelling dust and rust. Each step echoed as if someone were following her. When she reached the living room, the sound of the clock grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the floor, not the wall. She bent down and noticed a crack in the floorboards, thin, almost imperceptible. The wood seemed to have been replaced. She pulled gently, and the sound stopped. Sarah's breath became shallow, her heart racing. She stood still for a few seconds until she heard another sound coming from inside the house, slow, shuffling footsteps, as if someone were upstairs. The flashlight's light flickered, and a cold draft swept through the hallway. Sarah froze, trying to figure out if it was her mind playing tricks or if she really wasn't alone. A creak, then another. She backed toward the door, her entire body on alert. "Is anyone there?" she asked. but silence answered. Then suddenly a crash. Something fell from the upper floor and rolled down the stairs, coming to rest at her feet. It was an old firefighter's helmet, with the initials RH engraved inside. Sarah's heart leaped into her chest. She held the helmet in her hands and felt the weight of the cold metal. It was him, Richard Hale, the confirmation she needed. Frightened, she dropped the object and ran out of the house, stumbling over the gate. She got into her car, panting. And stood there for a few minutes, unable to start the engine. The sound of the clock still echoed in her head, as if it had become embedded in her ears. That helmet, that symbol, those initials. Nothing was a coincidence anymore. Richard had some direct connection to Emily's disappearance. But why? And what was inside that house besides what she saw? When dawn broke, Sarah returned to the police station with her helmet in her hands, covered in dust and rust. Lieutenant Briggs was visibly irritated. He told her she couldn't trespass on private property and that if she continued, she could be prosecuted. Sarah tried to explain what she'd seen, but he wouldn't listen. He told her to go home and let the past rest. The way he said it made something inside her freeze, rest, as if he were insinuating that Emily was no longer alive. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She ran her fingers over the initials engraved on the helmet, feeling the cold metal, trying to imagine how many times. That man had held them with his bare hands. She wondered what a firefighter, someone trained to save lives, could possibly hide within the walls of his own home. And the more she thought, the more the memory of that metallic sound tormented her. The clock, the noise, the rhythm, as if something inside still pulsed, trapped, waiting to be discovered. And maybe, just maybe, what she found behind that wall would change everything she believed about her daughter's disappearance. The next morning, Sarah woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if she had finally let go of her fear, and in its place had been born something stronger, a conviction. She understood that there was no point in waiting for someone to solve the case, that no police officer would ever care again, that no one would do what only she could do. Emily was her daughter, and as long as there was even a slim chance of finding her, she would see it through, even if she had to face hell alone. He took out the old notebook, where he had been writing down everything since 2009, and wrote at the top of the page, "Day 1 of my own investigation." Her handwriting trembled, but her purpose was firm. She reread all her previous notes, the times, the names, the details that before had seemed too small to matter. Now each one took on new meaning. That metallic clock that kept appearing, Richard Hale's name, the construction work on the house, the hollow sound coming from the floor. Everything pointed to the same place. That was where she needed to return. Sarah knew she couldn't make the same mistake as the night before. Going in alone again would be too dangerous, but she also couldn't rely on the police. So she decided to proceed with caution. She spent the afternoon calling old co-workers at the hospital, discreetly asking if anyone knew anyone in the fire department or city hall. A friend recommended a man named Ben Coleman, an electrician who worked with safety inspections. Sarah met him at a local cafe and told him only part of the story. She suspected an irregular installation and needed to check an old house. Ben, curious and friendly, agreed to help without asking too many questions. The next day they went to Richard Hale's house. Ben opened the gate with a metal hook and commented, These old houses hide so many things. I've seen walls with secret compartments, floors with a false bottom, the devil. Sarah just nodded, her heart hammering. They entered cautiously. The house. Seemed even colder than before. The air was heavy, dense, and the floor creaked underfoot. Ben began inspecting the structure with a flashlight, tapping on the walls to identify the sound. At one tap, he stopped. He looked at Sarah and said softly, "Did you hear that? This part is hollow." She moved closer. The sound was different, muffled, but with a strange vibration, almost as if there were a hidden space behind it. Ben took a screwdriver and began removing part of the baseboard. Behind the wood was a layer of plaster too fresh to be from a house abandoned years ago. "Someone's been in here recently," he murmured. Sarah's throat felt dry. The idea that someone might still be using this place sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling, as if someone were walking barefoot on the old floorboards. Ben raised his flashlight, but the beam caught nothing but shadows. "Is anyone here?" he shouted. No answer. The silence. That followed was worse than the sound. Sarah could feel the blood pounding in her temples. He grabbed Ben's arm and whispered, "Let's go." But before he could answer, something fell to the floor, a small, thin metal chain covered in rust. Sarah bent down to pick it up and realized it was a child's bracelet, a heart-shaped pendant with a faded inscription, ERC, Emily Rose Carter. Time seemed to stand still. Sarah stood there, motionless, holding the object with trembling hands. The ground. Spun, the sound of her own heart drowning out all others. The bracelet was real. It was there. And if it was there, it meant Emily had been there too. Ben noticed her expression and asked what she'd found, but Sarah didn't answer. She pocketed the bracelet and said simply, "There's something behind that wall, I know there is." In the next few minutes, fear gave way to urgency. Ben began to carefully break through part of the wall, but the dust and musty smell were almost unbearable. When the hole was large enough, they realized that the space behind it wasn't just a compartment. It looked like the beginning of a narrow hallway, as if someone had built an entire hidden room inside the house. The air escaping was thick, cold, and carried a strong smell of metal and damp. Ben hesitated, but Sarah didn't. She grabbed the flashlight and leaned in for a better look. The beam illuminated something on the floor, a chair, a chain attached to the wall, and what looked like an old mattress. Covered in dirty rags. She backed away, her stomach tightening. Everything inside her screamed to get out of there, but at the same time, something stronger was pushing her forward. An instinct. A calling. She knew deep down that this was the beginning of the truth. Ben insisted they leave and call the police, but Sarah refused. They won't believe it. They never did. The words came out firm, almost cold. She took out her phone and took several photos of the scene, focusing on the chains, the chair, the marks on the floor. Then she returned her eyes to the gaping hole and remained silent for long seconds, listening to the echo of her own fear. The sound of the metallic clock echoed in her mind again, as if coming from inside that wall. When they left the house, Sarah knew there was no turning back. This discovery changed everything. The evidence was there for her, even if no one would accept it yet. But what haunted her most was something else. Something she hadn't told Ben. Something She felt as she leaned over the hole, a faint sound coming from inside, barely audible but unmistakable, breathing, faint, slow, and alive. Sarah spent the next few days in a constant state of tension. She slept little, her heart racing with every noise in the house, and she mentally relived the sound of that muffled breathing. It was as if the air had taken on a different weight since she'd first laid eyes on that hole in the wall. The images wouldn't leave her mind, the chains, the dirty mattress, the smell of rust and damp. Everything pointed to something beyond simple explanation. And worst of all, she had no one to turn to. The authorities didn't believe her, her neighbors thought she'd gone mad, and her few remaining friends drifted away one by one. Sarah was alone, again, but there was a difference this time. Before, she was a desperate mother. Now, she was a determined woman, fueled by the certainty that she was closer to the truth than ever. Still, the emotional toll was beginning to take its toll. Her tired face, the deep circles under her eyes, her exhausted body, Sarah seemed a shadow of the woman she once was. At the hospital, her colleagues noticed her distraction. She forgot charts, missed appointments, talked to herself, until one day her supervisor called her in for a talk. "You need some time, Sarah," he said in a worried voice. "This is all destroying you." She was silent for a few seconds, then replied, without looking at him, "It will only end when I..." Know what happened to my daughter? At home, the walls felt tighter. Emily's bedroom lamp remained on every night, like a promise she refused to break. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of her daughter's bed and stare into space for hours, remembering her laughter, her sweet voice saying, "Good night, Mom." It hurt more than any physical wound. It was a pain that didn't bleed, but gnawed at the inside. And along with the pain came the question, what if Emily was still there? What if that breath, were real? But the fatigue wasn't just mental. Sarah began to feel her body failing her, dizziness, fainting, anxiety attacks. Her heart raced for no reason, and she was short of breath. She was rushed to the emergency room after collapsing in the middle of the street. Doctors said it was extreme stress and mental exhaustion. She was prescribed rest, but how could she rest when her instincts screamed that her daughter might be alive, trapped somewhere? She pretended to accept it, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't stop. The bills also began to pile up. Laying off work reduced her income, and little by little, she had to sell household items to pay the rent. Emily's piano, the family jewelry, even her old bicycle were gone. With each lost object, a memory seemed to fade, and Sarah felt she was fighting not only against time, but against oblivion. The whole world seemed to want to push Emily's story into the past, bury it as a forgotten case. But she wouldn't allow it, even isolated. Sarah continued to investigate. She returned to Richard Hale's house often, always alone, always at night. She entered silently, following the same path to the hollow wall, as if the place had become an extension of herself. Sometimes she knelt before the hole and simply listened. The sound was there, fading ever fainter, but still present. A breath that seemed trapped between the walls. It was so subtle it could have been just the wind, but the wind doesn't cry. And as this doubt grew within, something began to change. Sarah's face hardened, her gaze grew colder. Those around her noticed, but no one understood. She was transforming, no longer just a grieving mother, but someone willing to cross any line to get to the truth. The photos on the living room wall were now accompanied by new notes, arrows, circles, times, and addresses. It was the portrait of a mind at war, of someone who had already lost everything, and therefore was no longer afraid of losing anything. But all this. Surrender took its toll. Her body was no longer responding. Sleep came in fragments, and sanity seemed to slip through her fingers. Some nights, Sarah swore she heard Emily's voice calling her name. Other times, she woke in a sweat, with the sensation that someone was standing in the room. She began to wonder how much she could still trust her own senses. But then she remembered the bracelet, the helmet, the hollow wall. This was real. And if it was real, she wasn't yet crazy. By then, Sarah was no longer speaking to anyone. She just wrote, watched, and waited. Her fear had turned into silent determination, but deep down, something in her knew this path had a price. Every secret hidden too long eventually exacts its toll. And in that house, behind that wall where the silence seemed to breathe, something still existed, something Sarah was about to discover, even if it cost her what little she had left. Richard Hale was a man who went unnoticed. No one described him as dangerous. No one suspected him. He was the kind of person who greeted neighbors with a discreet wave, who always mowed the lawn at the same time, and attended neighborhood parties bringing home-baked apple pies. Solitary, methodical, always calm-spoken and impeccably poised, he seemed like one of those elderly men who grow old alone, with their quirks and memories. But behind this ordinary image lay something no one saw, and perhaps even wanted to see. What Richard hid wasn't just loneliness, it was a kind of control, an unhealthy need to dominate, to fix the world around him. He had retired from the fire department years before Emily's disappearance. He was an exemplary professional, recognized for his discipline and precision, but his co-workers whispered that he had strange behavior. He spent too much time alone during inspections, avoided teamwork, and had an unusual fascination with enclosed structures, walls, basements, tight spaces. He would say that every wall holds a secret, a phrase that at the time seemed like nothing more than the daydream of someone living in the silence of fires and ruins. When his wife died in 2006, Richard completely isolated himself. The house where they lived became both his refuge and his prison. He spent his days renovating, repairing, measuring, and rebuilding rooms that were already perfect. His neighbors thought he did this to pass the time, but the truth was different. He was creating a space no one else would know about. A place tailored to satisfy the distorted emptiness growing inside him. A remodeled basement, double walls, false partitions, and passages only he knew how to access. The once ordinary house became a labyrinth of secrets. In the months before Emily's disappearance, Richard began leaving the house more frequently. He went to the neighborhood school under the guise of giving safety talks. Apparently it was a noble gesture, a former firefighter teaching children how to protect themselves. And that's how he met Emily. Everyone saw him as a kind, attentive, almost paternal old man. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, but when he spoke to the children, his voice took on a different tone, firm and almost hypnotic. Emily, curious and trusting, saw no danger in this man who seemed to know everything about the neighborhood and the family's past. Little by little, Richard began to get closer. Sometimes he'd pass by the Carter's house and greet Sarah politely. Once, he helped change a light bulb on the porch. Another. Time? He fixed a leaky faucet free of charge. He was attentive, helpful, the kind of neighbor everyone would love to have. Sarah never imagined this seemingly kind man could hide something so dark. He observed everything, studied routines, schedules, commutes. He knew when Sarah left for work, how long it took Emily to get home from school, and when the lights in the house went out. What no one realized was that while the neighborhood slept, Richard worked. The sound of hammering, which many thought was endless renovations, was actually the construction of something carefully planned. A false wall, reinforced with concrete and soundproofing. A small dark space, but large enough to keep someone inside for a long time. He did everything with surgical precision. No trace, no mistakes. It was as if he were preparing the stage for a ritual. To others, Richard was just an eccentric man. But deep down, he believed he was saving people. Girls who, he believed, needed protection from a cruel world. He told himself he wasn't a kidnapper, but a guardian. A distorted way of thinking, the result of a mind that mixed trauma, isolation, and delusion. After his wife's death, the line between right and wrong was completely blurred. Loneliness became an excuse and the desire for control and addiction. When Emily disappeared, Richard was there, participating in the search. He carried boxes, offered coffee, and offered suggestions on where to look. And when everyone returned home, exhausted, he returned to the same spot where she was, just a few feet from where everyone was searching. Richard's wickedness lay not in the act itself, but in the coldness with which he maintained a semblance of innocence. For years he lived normally, while Emily breathed behind the false wall, unable to see the light of day. The neighborhood, which saw him as a hero, never suspected. Time passed, and the sound of tools became part of everyday life, a background noise no one noticed. Anymore. Until he died quietly of natural causes, leaving behind a house full of mysteries and a wall that hid the biggest of them. And it was this wall, built with patience and cruelty, that years later would draw attention again, not because of Richard, but because of a woman who refused to accept silence as an answer. And without knowing it, Sarah was about to face not only the echo of a man's insanity, but something even more disturbing, the discovery that evil often disguises itself as good. Time seemed to go in circles, repeating the same pain with a new face. When the news of the disappearance of Megan O'Neill, when 2016 arrived, Sarah felt the ground drop from under her feet. Megan was an 18-year-old girl, Emily's childhood friend, and the way she disappeared was eerily familiar. She disappeared on her way home from school, on the same route in the same neighborhood, almost at the same spot where Emily was last seen. Her backpack was found folded, leaning against a fence. Her cell phone turned off, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if someone was repeating the same script, step by step. The town was once again in panic, but for Sarah it was no coincidence. It was a warning, a cruel reminder that what happened to Emily wasn't over. This time she decided to act before everything got lost in bureaucracy. She gathered her old notes, compared times, routes, and locations, and it was there, amidst scribbled maps and newspaper clippings, that a pattern began. To emerge clearly. All the disappearances, Emily, Megan, and other girls who had vanished nearby over the past 15 years, occurred within a radius of less than a mile of Richard Hale's house. No matter the year or the victim, the epicenter was always the same. The police again were skeptical, claiming that geographical coincidences were not proof, but Sarah no longer believed in coincidences. She began to walk the neighborhood again, this time with different eyes. She visited the places where the girls had last been seen, compared routes marked points on the map, and the more she observed, the more she saw a hidden pattern no one had noticed. The security cameras, for example, there was always a blind section in the footage, right between two corners. The streets were the same, the travel time identical. It was as if the kidnapper knew every corner of the neighborhood, every hole in the investigation. And if Richard Hale were dead, who else would know all this? Or worse, who? Could be continuing what he started. Driven by this doubt, Sarah began to do what the police refused to do. She visited the police station, requested access to Megan's missing person reports, and secretly obtained copies. She spent sleepless nights comparing the two cases. She realized that both investigations shared one identical detail. The same investigator had been responsible for both incidents. The same man who years earlier had told her that Emily probably ran away. That made something inside Sarah snap. The idea that someone within the police force might be involved, or covering something up, ignited a flame she could no longer extinguish. Determined to see it through, Sarah devised a plan. She would return to Richard's house, this time prepared to find evidence that would silence any skeptics. She bought a more powerful flashlight, a camera with a flash, gloves, and a mask. She waited for nightfall and parked the car 2 streets away. The neighborhood was asleep, and the silence broken only by the distant sound of the wind blowing through the trees. She entered through the back gate as before, but this time there was no hesitation. She knew exactly what she was looking for. As he entered, dust rose in clouds, the heavy air sticking to his throat. The flashlight illuminated the marks on the wall, the remains of broken plaster from his last visit. He walked to the hole Ben had made weeks before. His heart pounded like a drum, fear and adrenaline mixing in. Proportions that put his entire body on alert. He stuck his arm through the hole and felt the cold air coming from within. The hidden space seemed larger than he remembered. Then, with effort, he pushed one of the sideboards open and opened enough space to enter. The hallway was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls covered in a layer of mold and grime. Each step echoed hollowly, as if the floor held ancient echoes. Sarah breathed heavily, trying to contain her panic. The flashlight illuminated the uneven floor, revealing small objects scattered about. A child's hairbrush, a matchbox, a school uniform button. It was like entering a graveyard of memories. Further ahead, the passage opened into a small room with a wooden chair, loose chains, and a torn mattress. The smell was unbearable, rust, mildew, and something sweet and rotten. Sarah raised her hand to cover her face, and then saw on the wall something that chilled her blood, a set of fingernail marks, hundreds of lines clustered. Together, as if someone had counted the days one by one. She ran her fingers over the marks and felt the relief of broken nails on the wall. Each line was a silent plea. Suddenly she heard a sound coming from somewhere deeper, something metallic, like a chain being dragged. She stopped breathing for a second. She instinctively turned off the flashlight and lay still, listening. The sound repeated, louder this time, followed by a muffled noise, almost like a moan. Sarah felt a chill run down her. spine. She couldn't tell if it was fear distorting the silence or if something or someone was still inside. She turned the flashlight back on and swung the beam around the room until the reflection caught something in the corner. An old mirror, stained and cracked. And for a moment she swore she saw a shadow move behind her. Instinct screamed to get out of there, but his rational mind, or what remained of it, said otherwise. This wasn't a ghost. There was an explanation, and he had to find it. He grabbed his camera and began photographing everything. The mattress, the marks, the floor, the chains. The flash cut through the darkness like small thunderclaps. Each click was a way of saying, "I saw it, I know." When he finished, he gave the flashlight one last sweep, and it was then that he noticed a small ventilation grate near the ceiling, covered in a thin layer of dust. He climbed onto a chair and tried to peer inside. Behind the grate was a narrow tunnel, and something glinted at the end. Sarah pulled hard on the grate until it gave way, revealing a dark hole. The beam from the flashlight illuminated a string of cables and a small metal device attached to the wall. It was a microphone, connected to wires that ran to the upper floor. Sarah's blood ran cold. Richard was listening in on the room. He heard everything, every sound, every cry, every attempt to call for help. It all passed through his ears. And if Megan had disappeared years after Richard's death, it meant someone. Had inherited that system. Someone who knew exactly how it worked. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed behind her, a snap, like a door closing. The flashlight beam flickered, and the air seemed to thicken. Sarah turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw that the hole she had entered through was now dark. And for a brief moment, she thought she heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy footsteps, stopping right in front of the false wall. She stood still, not daring to breathe. On the other side, someone was also waiting. And in that oppressive silence between two held breaths, Sarah understood. The nightmare that began in 2009 was not over yet. And perhaps, at that very moment, the real culprit was there, standing just a few feet away from her, just waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. Sarah left Richard Hale's house in a panic, her heart racing and her hands shaking. He couldn't quite remember how he managed to get back into his car or how he'd driven home. She spent the rest of the night locked in her room, sitting on the floor, looking at the photos she'd taken. Each image seemed to scream a truth the world refused to hear. The nail marks on the walls, the chains, the hidden microphone. It was impossible to deny. Emily had been there. Maybe even for years. But the more she looked, the more a terrible doubt grew within her. What if someone was still trapped inside? As soon as day broke, she went to the police station. She carried the flash drive with the photos, the bracelet, the helmet, and the printed report of the construction material purchases. This time she thought they would have to question her. But what she found was exactly the opposite. Lieutenant Briggs quickly looked at the photos and pushed the flash drive back to her. He said that without proof of recent activity and without a warrant, nothing could be done. "This house is private property now, Ms. Carter. We can't go in there just because you think something's strange, and frankly, you've already gone too far." Sarah tried to argue, to explain about the breathing, the microphone, the sound of footsteps, but Briggs just sighed and said, "Maybe you're hearing things. Prolonged grief does that." This hurt her more than any blow. It was the same old disbelief, the same contempt disguised as empathy. She felt her face burn and replied in a shaky voice, "It's not the grief that's driving me crazy. It's what you don't want to see." She left before he could say anything else. In the police station parking lot, she sat in her car and cried for the first time in a long time. She cried not from sadness, but from anger. Anger at knowing she was right and being treated like a crazy person. Anger at seeing that no one wanted to dirty their hands with the truth. And in the midst of her tears, a decision began to form. If the police wouldn't do anything, she would. Somehow, she would expose what was behind that wall, if it were the last thing she did. In the following days, Sarah began planning. She bought an audio recorder, installed a small hidden camera in her car, and researched how to request a safety inspection of older properties. She discovered that, in some cases, firefighters could enter abandoned homes to check for structural collapse risks. It was the opening she needed. She spent hours writing an anonymous report stating that there was a risk of collapse in the home that had previously belonged to Richard Hale. She sent it and waited. But while she waited, something began to happen. On the second day after the report, Sarah noticed that the living room clock, the same one she'd bought at the pawn shop and bearing Hale's initials, had moved. It was now on the dining table facing the wall. She was certain she hadn't moved it. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to distraction, but the next day she found the back door ajar. No sign of a break-in, no robbery. Just the door, open, as if someone had left or entered. The fear returned with a vengeance. The nights grew too long. Every noise felt like a warning. The sound of the wind hitting the windows sounded like footsteps. The creaking of the wood sounded like breathing. And amid this silent terror, she began to doubt even her own mind. Was she becoming paranoid, or was someone really watching her? The answer came brutally. 3 days later, as she went out to get her car, Sarah found something on the windshield, a printed photograph. It was a dark, grainy image taken from afar. It showed her standing in front of Richard's house the night she had entered alone. Behind her, a hazy shadow was projected against the wall. Her legs gave out. The paper fell to the ground and flew away in the wind. On the back of the photo was a single handwritten word, "It seems." The message was clear. Someone knew what she was doing. Someone was following her every step, and that "stop" didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a threat. Sarah looked around, her heart racing, but the street was empty. The silence was heavy. That night she slept with the doors locked and her cell phone recording continuously. At 2:47 in the morning, the same time as the old calls, her phone vibrated. A message with no number appeared on the screen. "You don't understand what you're messing with." Her body froze, the air grew heavy, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than ever. The police could ignore it. The neighborhood could forget. But whatever was hidden in that house, and whoever still protected it, wasn't about to let Sarah stop. And as she tried to decide what to do, a new siren began to echo in the distance. It was the sound of firefighters being called. And for a moment, she believed someone had finally heard. The problem is when a fire starts to spread, the one who puts it out isn't always the one who comes to save. The sound of sirens piercing the air made Sarah leave the house almost without thinking. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. As she turned the corner, she saw the red cars parked in front of Richard Hale's old house. The lights swirled, reflecting off the windows, painting the walls with shades of red and blue. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. That scene, which she had been waiting for years, was finally happening. The firefighters were there. Maybe finally someone had heard her. Maybe the hell she was carrying on her shoulders was about to end. She ran to the sidewalk, screaming. Trying to explain that the house was dangerous, that there was something inside the walls. One of the officers stopped her from approaching, saying the call was about a possible gas leak. Sarah, gasping, denied it. "No, you don't understand. It's not a leak, it's inside, behind the wall." But the firefighter, a tall man with a sweaty, soot-covered face, replied firmly, "Ma'am, get back to the security cordon. We'll take care of this." She stood still, watching as they entered. The doors opened. And the sound of boots and radios filled the air. Sarah felt her entire body vibrate with anxiety, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the entrance. With each passing minute, I imagined what they would find. The chains, the marks on the walls, the hidden microphone, everything she'd tried to prove on her own. And then, finally, the truth would come out. Minutes turned into an eternity. Firefighters came and went, carrying equipment, breaking down walls, cutting boards. The clanking of tools. Mixed with muffled shouts of instructions. Sarah watched it all motionless, unable to blink. Part of her wanted to run inside and see for herself. Another feared what they would find. And then, suddenly, a strange sound broke the chaos. A dull thud, followed by absolute silence. All eyes turned to the side of the house where the sound was coming from. One of the firefighters appeared in the doorway, sweaty, pale, breathing heavily. "There's something here," he shouted. Sarah felt her body shudder. The word echoed like a bolt of lightning. Something. She ran to the cordon before anyone could stop her. The firefighters were backing away from where they were tearing down the wall, and it was there, amid the dust and rubble, that she saw it. The false wall had been opened. Behind it, a narrow, dark room covered in dirt and rust. The flashlight beams danced across the surfaces, revealing a fallen chair, the remains of chains, and old rags. One of the firefighters stepped back, saying, something low that Sarah couldn't make out. Then the sound from inside made everyone freeze. A groan, faint, almost a whisper, but real. The nearest firefighter knelt down and shined his flashlight. "Someone's here," he shouted. Sarah didn't wait. She ran. She didn't hear the screams for her to stop. She jumped over the rubble, tripped over pieces of wood, and when she looked inside, she saw it. In the corner, huddled under a filthy blanket, was a woman, her face pale, her gaze lost, her hair long and tangled. For a second, Sarah thought her heart would stop, because even after so many years, even with her face scarred by time and suffering, she would recognize those eyes anywhere. "Emily?" Her voice barely came out. The air grew heavy, her legs gave out. She cried soundlessly, unable to understand how it was possible. The firefighter pulled out his radio, calling for medical help. Others entered the room, carefully trying to clear the rubble. Sarah tried to approach, but was restrained. She remained there, kneeling, tears falling uncontrollably, her body shaking with relief and horror. The next few minutes were blurry. The room became a jumble of voices, screams, and cries. The medical team entered and placed Emily on a stretcher. She was alive, weak, dehydrated with deep bruises on her wrists, but alive. Sarah tried to reach her, but a paramedic gently pulled her away, telling her they needed space. "She'll be fine, Mom. She'll be fine." As she watched her, daughter being taken away, Sarah could barely breathe. The world seemed to spin slowly, and the sound of sirens sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. After 8 years, Emily was there. No longer a memory, not a photograph. She was real and alive. But amid the relief, a question began to grow, dark, inescapable. Who had kept Emily there for so long? Richard Hale had been dead for years, which meant someone had kept the captivity going, someone who knew everything, the false walls, the microphones, the secret entrances, someone who somehow still walked those same streets free. Sarah looked around, her heart pounding, and for a moment she had the distinct feeling she was being watched. Amid the chaos, a firefighter passed her, carrying a dirty toolbox. When he turned, Sarah saw the name embroidered on his uniform. Briggs, the same lieutenant who ignored her complaints, the same man who told her to let bygones be bygones. He looked at her, and for a second smiled. A small, cold smile, and then he continued walking, disappearing into the smoke and flashing lights. And in that instant, Sarah understood that the rescue she had so longed for might not be the end of the story, but only the beginning of an even darker truth, one that the fire of the sirens would not be able to erase. The moment of rescue was like a collapse between dream and nightmare. Time seemed to distort. The sirens, the voices, the metallic sound of tools, everything blended into a confusing symphony Sarah would never forget. She was still kneeling on the ground, her body covered in dust, when she heard someone shout, "She's breathing!" That made her stand up suddenly, as if the ground had come back into existence. The whole world revolved around that phrase. After 8 years, Emily was alive. The firefighters removed pieces of wood, sheets and chains until they made enough room to pull the young woman out. Sarah saw her daughter's body being lifted, thin, frail, her face covered. In dirt and bruises, her eyes, half closed, tried to adjust to the light. For a second, Emily looked confused, then she put her hand to her eyes, as if shielding herself from a sun she hadn't seen in years. Sarah tried to run to her, but 2 paramedics held her back. She screamed her daughter's name, but her voice was broken with tears. "Emily, I'm here, my love, I'm here." Emily turned her head slowly, and when their eyes met, something happened. It wasn't a cinematic reunion, full of shouts and hugs. It was something silent, almost spiritual. Behind her tired eyes, Sarah saw the same look the girl had given her at the window every night before bed. Only now there was something different, a depth that time and trauma had carved. Emily didn't cry. She just watched her expression somewhere between relief and fear, as if she still wasn't sure if it was all real. As the paramedics worked, firefighters moved around, clearing debris. Sarah heard one of them comment in a low voice, that the room was soundproofed and had a ventilation opening hidden behind a concrete wall. Another said there were more blocked spaces, passages leading to other parts of the house. The horror never ended. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a labyrinth, a captivity designed so no one could escape or be heard. With each detail revealed, Sarah's stomach tightened. What had Emily experienced in there? What had she heard? What had she seen? What had she been forced to endure? Sarah's hands, trembled as she watched the stretcher being wheeled out, surrounded by professionals. Press cameras began to arrive. Journalists crowded in, microphones pointed, lights flashing. The case that for years had been treated as a teenage runaway story now exploded as one of the greatest horrors ever uncovered in Boston. Sarah walked behind the ambulance, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Her body seemed frail, but she was still breathing. And that was what mattered. The sound of the sirens was different now, not of tragedy but of rebirth. And for the first time in almost a decade, Sarah felt she could release the breath trapped in her chest. Hope, the one time had tried to tear away, was still there, alive like Emily. But even amid the chaos, something caught attention. A firefighter standing beside the demolished wall watched silently. The same man Sarah had seen hours earlier, Lieutenant Briggs. He wasn't helping with the search, wasn't speaking to anyone. He simply stared at the empty room, his face impassive, as if contemplating the end of something he knew all too well. And when Sarah looked at him, he looked away too quickly. In the ambulance, Emily began to mumble something. Her voice was weak, hoarse, almost soundless. Sarah leaned in, trying to understand. Emily kept repeating one phrase, always the same. "He said you weren't coming. He said it was just my imagination." The words fell like blades. Sarah choked back tears and held her daughter's hand, saying, simply, "I never stopped looking for you." On the drive to the hospital, the city lights flashed past the windows. Sarah watched Emily, trying to comprehend what was left of her after 8 years in the dark. She wanted to ask everything: who, how, why, but knew it wasn't time. Her daughter needed to breathe, to live, to feel the outside air again. Still, a gnawing doubt lingered. If Richard Hale had been dead since 2012, who had continued to feed and keep Emily alive all these years? The weight. Of that question mingled with the sound of the siren, pulsing in time with Sarah's heart. She squeezed her daughter's hand and silently promised that now nothing and no one would stop her from discovering the whole truth. Because the rescue, miraculous as it was, wasn't the end. It was merely the moment when the horror came to light. And the worst still lay hidden, not in the shadows of the house, but in the people who helped keep her alive, believing no one would ever find out. In the E. Hospital time seemed to stand still. The cold lights of the hallways, the smell of disinfectant and the intermittent sound of the monitors created a sense of suspended reality, as if everything could still be just a dream. Sarah paced back and forth in front of the room where Emily was being treated. She tried to remain calm, but her body trembled. Every second was torture. After 8 years, she finally had her daughter back, alive, breathing, and still the fear wouldn't go away. Fear that everything would fall apart, that she would open her eyes and find herself alone again. When the doctor left the room, Sarah nearly stumbled to reach him. The man's gaze was weary but kind. He said Emily was very weak, malnourished, and showing signs of prolonged confinement. He explained that she needed time and silence, that her body was weak, but miraculously her vital organs were preserved. Sarah could barely hear the words. She only managed a thank you before leaning her forehead against the wall and letting the tears fall. When they finally let her in, Sarah stopped at the door. Her daughter lay there, hooked up to machines, her hair dirty and tangled. Her pale skin contrasted with her sunken, watchful eyes. Emily didn't seem to recognize the world around her. Sarah approached slowly, sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. The touch was light but real. "It's okay, my love. It's okay now," she whispered, though even she didn't completely believe those words. For a moment, Emily stared distantly, then slowly turned her head and fixed her eyes on her mother. A brief flash of recognition crossed her empty gaze, and she wept silently. Sarah leaned over, hugged her daughter, and stood there, silent, feeling her fragile body tremble in her arms. There was nothing to say. The lost time, the stolen years, the nights of despair, none of it could be returned. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They were there, together. The following days were a mixture of pain and hope. Emily began to react slowly. She spoke little, sometimes only mumbling incoherent words. At night she woke screaming, gasping for breath, as if still trapped. Once she held her mother's arm and said, her voice trembling, "He came at night. He said you'd forgotten me." Sarah tried to remain calm, but her heart sank. She asked who he was, but Emily looked away and cried. The police began visiting the hospital, trying to gather statements. Sarah watched the questions, the cold faces of the investigators, and felt a growing hatred. These were the same people who had ignored her, who had called her paranoid, who had closed the case. Now they posed in front of the cameras as if they had solved everything. She refused to talk. He said only that everything was in the photos and reports he had already submitted. Her focus was Emily, and only Emily. Over time, the press began to surround the hospital. Reporters camped outside, headlines blared, "Miracle in Boston. Missing." Girl found alive after 8 years. But no one knew the full truth. No one knew what Emily really experienced there, what she heard, what she was forced to endure. Sarah read the news and felt angry. The case became a spectacle, and her daughter's suffering fueled the ratings. One night when the hospital finally fell silent, Sarah woke to a faint noise, a ticking sound. She opened her eyes and saw the digital clock on the wall blinking. But the sound wasn't coming from there. It was the same. Measured metallic sound she'd heard on the intercoms years ago. She got up slowly, her body tense, and followed the sound to the door. The hallway was empty. On the floor near the wall, something small reflected the light. Sarah bent down and found a piece of metal, a uniform button identical to the one she'd seen on Lieutenant Briggs's jumpsuit. Her heart raced. For a moment, she glanced into the room and saw Emily sleeping, her face serene. And then, for the first time since the rescue, a dark thought crossed her mind. What if the man who had ignored her all these years, the same man who had been present at the rescue, had a much bigger role than just neglect? What if the monster who had kept Emily alive for so long had never stopped watching them? Sarah sat back down in the chair beside her daughter's bed. She took her hand and squeezed it tightly. She looked at her sleeping daughter and whispered, "You're safe now." But inside, the words sounded false, broken, as if she didn't believe it. Outside, the wind beat against the windows, and somewhere far away, perhaps inside Sarah's own head, the sound of the clock continued. Tick-tock, tick-tock, reminding her that no matter how much hell had been revealed, evil was still loose, waiting for the right moment to return. 3 years have passed since that night when sirens cut through the silence and Emily was brought back into the light. Life has never been the same again. Not for Sarah, not for her daughter, not for the town she'd rather forget. The Carter house was sold, and in its place Sarah built something new, the foundation, light behind the wall, a space created to welcome families of the missing, offer psychological support, and keep alive the memory of those who have not yet returned. At first, she thought the work would help fill the void, that somehow transforming pain into purpose would bring peace. But the silence, the same silence that for so many years was her enemy, still haunted her every day. Emily was now 25. She still spoke little, rarely smiling. She spent most of her time at the foundation, in a secluded room, discreetly helping with documents, preferring the sound of paper to voices. There were good days, when her eyes seemed to shine a little brighter, and days when the past came rushing back, paralyzing her completely. Sarah accepted each upheaval with the patience of someone who has learned that healing isn't forgetting, it's living with what never goes away. But there was something Sarah couldn't shake, the questions that were never answered. The police report, closed as isolated crime committed by deceased individual, was never convincing. And the name of Briggs, the lieutenant who led the investigation, had disappeared from the records a month after the rescue. No explanation, no official statement. He was simply gone. Sometimes she thought she saw him on the streets, a tall, broad-shouldered man with the same heavy gait. But when she turned around, no one was there. It could be paranoia, or it could be the truth the world insisted on hiding. In the Foundation's office, Sarah kept a special shelf. On it were all the objects recovered from the captivity. Emily's necklace, the bracelet, a piece of the rusted chain, and in the center the wall clock. That same one with its metallic sound, with her initials engraved on the back. Its constant ticking had become a kind of living memory. Some found it morbid, but for her, it was a symbol of a resistance. A sound that once represented fear now marked the time she couldn't overcome. Still, sometimes, when the building was empty and the echo of the clock filled the hallways, Sarah felt chills. Because the sound didn't seem to come from the clock alone. It was deeper, more distant, as if there were another echo responding somewhere. One autumn afternoon, while sorting through old files, he found a box he didn't remember putting away. Inside was a yellowed, unmarked envelope with a single photo, a picture of Richard Hale's house on the day of the rescue. In the window, a dark, indistinct silhouette watched from afar. On the back, a single sentence written in firm handwriting. "Not all walls have fallen." Sarah stood there, holding the photo, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock. It read exactly 2:47 in the morning, the same time as the calls. That night he returned home late. Emily was already asleep. The Foundation was silent. And the clock continued its endless cycle. Tick-tack, tick-tack. Sarah turned off the lights and stared at the object hanging on the wall. The memory of everything she'd experienced came back in waves. The fear, the loneliness, the sound of walls being torn down, her daughter's first glimpse after years in the dark. The truth had come to light, but justice still seemed a distant promise, and deep down she knew the evil that builds walls never completely disappears. It merely shifts, waiting for a new home, a new victim, a new silence in which to hide. Sarah took a deep breath, approached the clock and ran her hand over the engraved initials. The metal was cold, but vibrated slightly, as if something were pulsing inside. She smiled slightly, a tired smile, and whispered to herself, Some secrets never stop breathing. Then she turned off the lights and left, letting the sound of the clock echo through the empty room, the same sound that had once guided a mother to the truth, and that now, silently, promised something she wasn't yet sure she wanted to hear. That this story wasn't over yet. Now that you've made it this far, you've realized this story was more than a mystery. It was a dive into what fear, love, and truth can do to a person. Stories like this touch us because they remind us that behind every disappearance is someone fighting to be heard, and every minute you spend here helps give a voice to those who were once silenced. So, if this journey captivated you until the end, make this moment worthwhile. Leave the like and subscribe to the channel, because that's what keeps these stories alive and allows me to continue telling stories that were almost forgotten. Write the word here in the comments, true, to show that you believe she always finds a way to show up, even when the whole world tries to hide her. And that's it, because what comes next is even more intense. The next story isn't just about a disappearance, it's about what happens when the truth is discovered too. Late, you'll want to see it.